When you think about someone with a PhD from Harvard University, a PhD in neuroscience, you probably picture her in a lab coat, conducting experiments, publishing articles in scientific journals. You probably don't expect her to be writing best-selling novels that hit the New York Times bestsellers list, or that Julianne Moore would bring her most famous character to the big screen and win an Academy Award for it. But obviously, Lisa Genova got into Harvard by being an overachiever. In her novels, she shows both the physical and emotional complexities of a devastating diagnosis and how that diagnosis happens to a whole family. Despite having witnessed my grandmother's decline into dementia, it wasn't until I read Still Alice that I actually understood what it could be like to have Alzheimer's. That is Lisa's gift. Today, Lisa will be in conversation with Leigh Haber, books editor at O, the Oprah Magazine. Please welcome them to the stage.
It's going great.
Well, we just met today,
Yes.
but we've had a chance to get to know each other a little bit in the green room upstairs.
Yeah.
Isn't this an amazing, amazing event? So exciting.
Yes.
Thank you, Simon and Schuster.
I know.
To build on Wendy's comment a little bit, you know, when I think of a scientist, you know, I guess I have them kind of compartmentalized in my mind.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, you know, I see a scientist as being over here and a novelist as being over here. So what, you know, kind of brought you over to the other side? Or is there a kind of merging that goes on?
Yeah, the dark side.
The dark side.
Well, what brought me over was, and it's so funny listening to Lisa C. talk about, you know, why do we read and what do we get out of it? It really had to do with empathy and trying to understand someone else's experience. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's, and I was the neuroscientist in the family, and I was reading everything I could about Alzheimer's to help us stay connected to her and to help us take care of her. And while I learned a lot about the neurobiology, and I learned a lot about caregiving, and I learned a lot about the clinical management of the disease, I still didn't understand what it felt like to be her. And that was really the crucial piece missing for, you know, I could have sympathy for her, like this disease is so awful, I feel so bad for her, but I wasn't able to feel with her. And there's such a huge distance there. If you can collapse that and get to empathy, then you can begin to imagine her experience and stay connected as human beings.
Well, so what was your process like, you know, trying to imagine what it was to be her? I mean, did you interview people? Did you interview your grandmother? Did you Google? I mean, what was your process?
Yeah, so I began Still Alice in 2004. My grandmother had passed away in 2002. So, you know, becoming a novelist wasn't like, oh, yeah, that's what I'll just do.
Right.
It took a while to get to that. So I did a lot of research. I again read everything. I went to the medical community, so I spent a lot of time shadowing neurologists and sitting in on neuropsych testing
Wait, what's it like to shadow a neurologist? Isn't that a little scary?
No,
You're
those are
going
my
up behind them and looking at CAT scans and...
No, those are my people.
Oh, right.
So, yeah, so this is where that degree in neuroscience
Right.
came in really handy and does with every book I write, because this is just calling on the folks that I kind of already know. But the best research I did was I came to know 27 people living with early onset and or early stage Alzheimer's who could still talk about what it feels like to have it. So my grandmother was pretty far along by the time we diagnosed her and recognized that it wasn't just a normal part of normal aging. She was in her 80s, and I think we all had this expectation that this is just what happens.
Right.
And we were in a bit of denial because no one wants this to happen to someone you love. So I was talking to people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s every day for a year and a half while I was writing this book. And they really let me in on the good, bad, and the ugly of what it's like to have Alzheimer's.
And the fear that they must feel.
Yeah, so when you're diagnosed with something like Alzheimer's, you go through the stages of grief.
Right.
And so you go through the denial and the anger and the despair and the grief and the ultimately, hopefully, acceptance, but it's not linear, and there's no graph that predicts where you're going to be, and you bounce around. But generally, people are more fearful before the diagnosis because they don't know what the heck this is. Right. If you're 50 and you are starting to forget things that aren't normal, I mean, like, we all walk into a room.
That moment in Still Alice, where she is suddenly in her neighborhood,
yeah,
and she doesn't recognize it. It's the neighborhood where she's been,
yeah,
you know, for a really long time, and she's had a few moments before that of, you know, for not being able to remember where her BlackBerry is and so on. But that moment, that panic.
Yeah,
I really
should know
feel
this.
it.
And so that happens to, I mean, this is an example that so many people told me they'd be in Best Buy and suddenly not know where they were or why they were there, but they knew that they should know where I am and why I'm here. And so it's terrifying. You feel like you're going crazy, or you probably have a brain tumor, or something's horribly wrong. And while being diagnosed with Alzheimer's isn't news anyone wants, and it's a relief to at least know that it's not your fault, and that you can then, now what do I do?
Right. One of the things I love about your books is, I guess they scare me. You know, so I open, you know, I start one of your books, and, you know, it's kind of, often it's a very normal setting. You know, the husband and wife are getting their kids ready for school. The wife is putting Lucky Charms into a kid's bowl, etc. And but you know something's about to happen. You know, so you're turning the pages, and, you know, it's very domestic, but you know that something is about to turn. And I think one of the things you really get at in your fiction writing is that, you know, idea that, you know, life is normal until it's not, until it just 1 second changes everything. Is that what you're going for, or?
Yeah, that's what happens. So, you know, I'm always trying to portray the truth under the imagined circumstances. And so for anyone who's diagnosed with, whether it be ALS or Huntington's, autism, Alzheimer's.
Having a car accident.
That's what's going on. You're in the middle of your life, and so your relationships, are they in good shape, or are they in disrepair? Like, what is going on when this crisis hits? And then does that crisis bring you together or pull you apart? How do you frame what's going to happen to you next? And for some people, it brings them down. And for some people, while the disease is ultimately going to be the end, the process of getting there is sometimes sort of the most healing part of this person's entire life.
Well, that's the other thread, I think, that runs through all of your books, because what seems to happen is that there's a crisis occurs, and as you say, it gives the person, the victim, an opportunity to kind of reassess, you know, to reassess and say, do I need to be slowing down? Do I need to be being more careful about my children, my relationships, my career, whatever it is? So tell me how you know, is that something that you feel drives you in every piece of writing?
Yeah, because I'm writing fiction and not nonfiction, the book can't just be about Alzheimer's. It can't just be about a brain injury. Like, so what else is it about? And so I'm looking for, both in the research that I do and just sort of the literary metaphors that might come out of it. So with Alzheimer's, it's, you know, we place so much worth in our ability to remember and think. And we think of, you know, who are you? And you write your bio, and it's all these things that you've done. And what if you can't remember any of those? Who are you? Like, do you matter if you can't access those memories? So that book had to be a lot about identity. Left Neglected is about this bizarre brain condition.
Can you explain that to the audience? I don't know who's read that book, but it's so difficult to imagine that affliction.
Yeah.
She couldn't acknowledge the left side of her
perception, meeting people
right?
who have it, it's wild. So if you have left neglect, you have a brain injury caused by a stroke, a hemorrhage, or a traumatic brain injury to a part of your brain that pays attention to where things are in space. And you no longer can pay attention to or are aware of anything on the left side of anything, including the left side of you. So women, if you had this, you'd put makeup on the right side of your face, think you're totally done. Men, you'd have a full beard on one side and not know it. You'd eat food on the right side of your plate and think you've finished your meal until someone turns the plate.
You literally look down and you don't see
You
like the
see
mashed
it.
potatoes over here.
So interestingly, so your eyes work, so vision is intact, that gets into your brain no problem, and you're not paralyzed. I could use my left arm if only I recognized that it belonged to me. So the information goes in, but then the part of the brain that says, okay, pay attention to that, doesn't work. And people who have this just sort of assume a hole and you fill in. I try to explain to people, like, okay, if I drew a circle with 2 dots and a little half loop at the bottom, what is that? Smiley face, right? Well, I didn't draw a nose. I didn't draw ears. Are you like, oh, that person's missing a nose? Like, no. So people with left neglect, they're missing lots of what their brain isn't processing a lot of information, but they see enough to assume a whole. But they get into all kinds of trouble. A guy I know who has this, think of a camera shot. So like if you zoom in, if I'm zoomed in on those flowers and I have left neglect, I'm only registering the flowers on the right. But if my camera shot is like this, then the whole vase is now in the shot and I don't see any of you, or I don't recognize that you're there. I just see all of it.
So if you had it right now, I wouldn't even be here.
Well, I can hear you because the sound goes everywhere, but I don't know where you are. So this guy who has it, where'd that hand come from? This guy who has it says whenever he's out in public and has to use the restroom, it's a potential disaster because he never knows if he's going into the men's room or the woman's room because the W-O is on the left half of that word, so it's all the men's room.
Bizarre.
And in he goes, and there's all these ladies in there.
This can't be common.
You know, it's more common than you think, and I thought it was rare as well. No, you don't know much about it because there's no pharmaceutical to treat it, so no one's counting.
Right.
Remember people with this? It's it's a pretty high percentage of right side strokes.
That's really
if you
strange.
go to any rehab hospital in the country, if you know a nurse, ask a nurse. They all know people with left neglect.
Now, so did you, in the course of writing that book, did you interview a lot of people who had that syndrome?
Yeah. And so that book, what is it about? So here's a condition where it's this bizarre pathology where your brain doesn't pay attention to half of everything.
Right. So Sarah is the mother of 3.
Busy,
She's like 38 or so.
Yeah, mid-30s.
Mid-30s.
Trying to be it all, have
in
it all, do
a
it
car
all.
accident.
Yep.
One day she was texting, right, or looking for something.
So the book is about what do we pay attention to
Right.
and what don't we pay attention to. And so here's this pathological inattention, and we say, oh, that's so, bizarre. And yet how many of us every single day are not paying attention to the road and you're looking down at your phone, or you're not paying attention to the relationships that matter, or what is it that you really want to do? Or you're spreading yourself so thin because we all think we have to do 5 things at once. And when you do that, you're never really paying attention to any one of those adequately. And so the book is about sort of nourishing and paying attention to
by the way,
what
I didn't think
matters.
Bob was going to stay with her, but I guess I was wrong.
Yeah, it's so funny. People are like, when they compare those 2 books, because that was my second, my first, and how different John and Bob were. And I'm
Right.
like, well, I wrote Still Alice on the heels of a divorce. And then I was
wondered.
in a happier place writing Left Neglected.
Right. So your first book you actually self-published, and then it was found by an editor at Simon & Schuster.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Thank you, Simon & Schuster.
Yeah, amazing.
Getting that book out of the trunk of my car.
And then made into a film.
And then made into a film. I mean,
Did you get
it
to
was
be
nuts.
on the film set?
Yeah.
Or did you meet Julianne Moore?
Yeah. Yeah, I
it's
met
an
everyone.
amazing movie.
Thank you. Oh my God, thank
Amazing
God,
book.
because it could have been a train wreck, and they did such a beautiful job. Yeah, my first day on the set, I go in and they're all at the dining room table for the Christmas dinner, and so it's Alec Baldwin, and Julianne Moore, and Kristen Stewart, and Kate Bosworth, and I walk in, I go, I made all of you up, and here you are.
Yeah. Well, you did a good job conjuring them.
Thank
you. So you were talking a little bit about empathy before.
Yeah.
And there's a study by a bunch of cognitive scientists about growing empathy, actually literally changing your brain. And reading fiction actually does that even more than reading nonfiction. Are you familiar with that study?
Yeah.
Can you explain how that works? I mean, how the brain would have that ability to respond that way to reading fiction.
Well, fiction is a richer place for, again, there are these neurons in your brain called mirror neurons. And so anytime someone does something that we can imagine doing ourselves, our brain actually mimics it. So if you're reading about someone crying, there are neurons in your brain that are essentially mimicking the pattern of crying, even though you maybe aren't at this point. You're feeling that. So whatever the many characters are doing, you're imagining what that would be like. It's, you know, when you're, when I was writing Still Alice, I was also training as an actress, because this was something also that neuroscientists don't do, so I wanted to do that as well.
Well, you're really unattractive, so I don't understand what you're talking about.
So one of the things you do as have to learn to do as an actor is you don't pretend to feel grief, you don't pretend to be in love, you actually want to be able to embody that spontaneously in the moment. And it's tricking some circuitry in your brain to actually do that. So your body doesn't know the difference between actually being in love and reading about someone in love.
Wow.
And so you feel the same thing.
So do you think that's what drew you to writing fiction?
What drew me to fiction was, yeah, that ability to, what does Alzheimer's feel like? I really couldn't, for many reasons, you know, I was 28 when my grandmother was diagnosed. I just didn't have the confidence, and she was so far along that you couldn't have a coherent conversation with her too. I loved her so much, so I was really just heartbroken and unnerved by her behavior. I couldn't get to what does this feel like with her, and I had always been a reader, and I knew that fiction was a place where you can really feel what someone else's experience is.
Now, do you think you would ever write a book that didn't have to do with a neurological condition?
Yeah, it's so funny. When I started, my 16-year-old was, you know, younger, and she was into the Twilight movies at the time, and she was like, could you just write about werewolves and vampires sometime? No. You know, I think this is the unique thing that I bring to fiction. I really am incredibly passionate about our brains and how they work to allow us to think and feel and remember and desire, and our moods and our personalities, and then what happens when something goes wrong in there. And so, like, where the, you know, what part is you and what part is biology and what part is spirit. And I like sort of, these are the questions I wrestle with too. So it gets at sort of who are we and why are we here? Yeah.
So are you allowed to talk about your next project?
Yes.
Because I found out a little about this from you in the green room, and I was really fascinated by some of the interviews that you did with people who are afflicted with the next condition you're going to be writing about.
You can say it, yeah.
ALS.
I'm writing about, I've finished, we're editing now. I've written about ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And this one scares me more than any of them.
Can you describe what it is?
Yeah, ALS is a progressive neurodegenerative disease where you become increasingly paralyzed. So the motor neurons in your brain and spinal cord begin to degenerate, and they feed your muscles. And if the motor neurons are gone, your muscles don't work, and they'll atrophy. And so people become...
But your brain remains intact.
For most people. Some people end up with a little frontotemporal lobe dementia as well, but for most people, no, they're perfectly lucid.
And that's the scariest thing, really, because you become sort of
you're
trapped
locked
in your...
It's called locked in. Eventually, I mean, Stephen Hawking is quite unique in that he still has a muscle going in his cheek, and they've attached sensors to that so that he can still reach and communicate with the world. But for most people, eventually, if they choose, so eventually your diaphragm will become paralyzed and you won't breathe, and that's, without intervention, you'll suffocate and die. And it's fast. It's the median time is 3 years, but a lot of the people I know are here and gone in 15 months. And it's any age. I've met a Yale med student who was just diagnosed, many people in their 30s and 40s. A really amazing guy who just died in December who's 65. But you can get a tracheostomy tube and be on a ventilator and be kept alive mechanically indefinitely. But even on that, you know, these people who are on the trach tube, like Stephen Hawking, will either, you know, blink once for yes and nothing for no, or they'll have a little twitch. But eventually, the blinking will be gone and they'll just be locked in. And yeah,
That
that's
is
terrifying.
And you said that's the disease that really scares you the most. So is that why you decided to write about it, because it scares you the most?
No, I'm not looking to do that to myself. And I didn't know what I didn't know to begin with. I discover these books as I do the research. No, I decided to write this because Richard Glatzer, who was co-wrote the script for Still Alice and co-directed it, he was diagnosed with ALS just a couple months before he read the book, and had the enormous courage to decide to go ahead and make this movie, knowing it would be the last thing he'd ever be able to do. And so he actually directed this film. At that point, he could still walk. He had bulbar ALS, which means it starts in the head. So he couldn't speak. He's wearing a bib because he's drooling. Left arm was totally paralyzed, I believe. And in the right hand, he had like middle finger, I think, that he was typing on an iPad directing this movie. And when I tell you he was directing it, he really was. Like, he and Wash were a true partnership on this. And I love that, you know, when you show, like today, like you want to show up as your best self, right? We're getting hair and makeup and we're, you know, hopefully a good night's sleep.
I'm not wearing any makeup.
Yeah, right. Like you want to show up for anything important to you as your best self. And here's Richard willing to show up with ALS drooling on a set at the biggest movie of his life. And I just was amazed by his determination and his courage. And so I told him, it was September of 2014, just after the world premiere in Toronto, that I wanted to write about ALS in his honor. Would that be okay? And at this point, he's typing with his big toe. That's all he had left for. Yeah, so we communicated a bit that way for a couple of months. And then he died shortly after the Oscars. Yeah.
It's awful.
So, yeah.
So sorry. The 27-year-old Yale medical student that you mentioned, you know, I don't know if you ever read the book When Breath Becomes Air, was that what it's called?
Yeah.
But to me, the idea of being, you know, knowing a lot medically about a condition, you know, being a doctor, being a neuroscientist, and then, you know, realizing that you have something, that could either be terrifying or something that eases the path. I mean, for the Yale medical student, what?
I think it eases, what I've witnessed is it looks, I mean, nothing about this is easy, but having that background and sort of being colleagues, I listen in to the conversations that he has with his doctors, and they're peers.
Right.
And so there's less of a power differential, and the conversations are more like, he'll let the doctors know, like, all right, I found out about this study coming out of Israel, what do you think? And they're having a real conversation about, should I be in on that? How do we do it? And it's...
But at the same time, he knows more about the prognosis than a normal patient would.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know whether information is power or, you know, comfort in that situation.
It depends on who you are.
Right.
You know, I bumped up against this with Huntington's and Inside the O'Briens, this idea of knowing whether you have the gene that's going to give you Huntington's or not. And you can take the blood test to find out, and is information useful or not. And I went into it very black and white, thinking like, well, I would want to know, because I don't think I would want to live with the anxiety every day of not knowing. And every time I dropped my fork or my phone or stumbled on a word or tripped on a step, I'd think, oh my God, here it is, it's starting. But for many other people, they're just different than I am. And they thought, no, I would never want to know if I had it. If I knew I was going to get it, I'd jump off a bridge. So it's just, yeah, everyone's different.
So would you ever write a nonfiction book?
Oh, so funny you should ask.
Really?
Did somebody plant you here?
No.
Yes, I think I want to write a book about memory. I'm giving a TED Talk in April, and the title of my talk is Changing Your Brain's Destiny, the Neuroscience of Preventing Alzheimer's. And I've been talking about Alzheimer's since 2009, doing a lot of advocacy work and educating people about, you know, what does this feel like and how do you deal with this, and what is science doing about this, and what is memory? Like, when is forgetting normal and when is it not normal? And why do we forget things? And when is that actually useful? And how do you enhance your memory and how do you protect it? And these are things that people are constantly wanting to know, especially as we age. And so I think
do the New York Times crossword puzzle every single day. Is that good?
Yeah, no.
No? What? Then why have I been bothering?
Yeah, you gotta do other things. No, all right, I don't know how much time we have, but
3 minutes.
All right, so no, the crossword puzzles are not what we mean, but we do mean you're on the right track. So what we want you to do is have a lot of cognitive reserve, which means that we want you to have a lot of neural connections, and you build and lose connections all the time. It's called neural plasticity. That's a common word these days, which cracks me up. Like, you guys are all becoming nerdy neuroscientists and you don't even know it. So the way you build new neural connections is learning new things. And so crosswords are really just sort of retrieving information you already know. You're not really building any new roads. You're just going through old neighborhoods trying to find stuff that's there. The reason why you want to build more cognitive reserve is because, okay, so if you're about 40 years old, you're already starting to accumulate the stuff that builds into Alzheimer's eventually. Yeah, and
what if you're 59?
You've got some, yeah. So you've got some Alzheimer's in there, but you don't notice it because it hasn't reached a tipping point. Once it hits a tipping point, then you start to have memory glitches that are not normal. But prior to that, you're okay, and the way you can get around once it hits a tipping point is to have lots of neurons that aren't affected yet. And you build lots of neuronal connections that aren't affected yet by learning new things. So you want to play the piano or take dance lessons or meet new people or go to a book club and listen to a conversation, read a new book. Like, just stay intellectually curious and engaged, and you're learning new information. That is really what's going to keep your brain
fantastic.
Resilient to any presence of Alzheimer's.
So I guess as book people, we're on the right track.
Truly. So there's been studies that show that people who have a higher degree of literacy are more resilient to having Alzheimer's.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, so good for all of us. Yeah.
Well, we have like 1 minute.
All right.
So if you could say anything about the mystery of the brain, what about the brain most mystifies or fascinates you?
Oh my God.
I know, that's just like a 1 minute question.
I mean, the holy grail of neuroscience is consciousness. So, how do you the reason I loved neuroscience to begin with is the heart's a pump, the kidney's a filter, the brain, you can think about it can think about itself. That's and so
I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, I mean, and so if you read Eckhart Tolle and books like that, when that sort of or even right now, if you just got quiet for a minute, you'd start to listen to the voice in your head talk, and it's well, you're listening to who? So this idea of consciousness and just the awareness of being is kind of the
We
holy
smoked
grail.
a little pot before we got up here. All right.
All right.
Well, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Leigh.
Pleasure.